My first step in the fabrication process will be to make the fabric socket. I'll get this sewn up while waiting on the stabilizing unit test socket to be pulled and trimmed out. The included pattern shows 3 general sizes, small, medium, and large. Use these as a general pattern guide to start, but your final pattern may have slightly different contouring than these. The fabric socket pattern essentially makes up a vest shape. The right top side of the pattern fits over the top of the patient's prosthetic side shoulder area, and the top left side obviously is where the patient's sound arm goes through. The tops of the 2 shoulder areas are the only spots that require sewing. Be sure to save your final pattern as it will be custom fit to your patient, and you'll likely want to make a few of the final vest sections as your patient will be able to swap them out to wash. Each fabrication kit comes with enough material to make 2 sets of fabric socket vest sections. Lay out the fabric over the pattern and trace it with a dark colored Sharpie marker onto the fabric. Then cut out the pattern. Pay attention to the orientation of the diamond mesh pattern as well, as the fabric has more stretch in one direction than the other. I prefer to keep the diamond mesh pattern with the long side of the mesh up and down. Next, sew together the top of the shoulder areas. These are the only 2 sections that need to be sewn in the design. You are welcome to add a cosmetic seam on the edges of the material, but it definitely is not required as the fabric will not unravel on the cut edges. Try the vest onto the patient, pull it as snug as possible and make note of any areas that are obviously loose. Then just make adjustments as necessary. You will likely make a few minor sewing adjustments to get it to be intimately fit to the patient. It can be helpful to have a stapler handy so you can pull loose areas tight and staple up the extra material. This helps mark the new sewing line. Once you've made any final sewing adjustments, try it back on the patient and pull it tight once again. Mark with a Sharpie marker a general path for the force distribution cable to route through. You can see in the picture where I've marked the path of the cable. The cable should run over the top of the shoulder, then curve slightly toward the midline as it goes down the front of the chest, then wrap toward the back at about the level of the distal end of the stabilizing unit frame. It will then run up the back towards the midline and then connect again over the top of the shoulder, completing the loop. Be sure to not let the cable routing come too far over to the midline where it would overlap the stabilizing unit frame. You want to leave at least 2 to 3 inches between the stabilizing unit and the force distribution cable so that you have room to adjust the tightness of the socket on the patient. This picture shows roughly what the final cable routing will look like, so keep this image in mind as you're marking the routing on your patient. The force distribution cabling will largely mirror the stabilizing unit frame shape. Next, route the force distribution cable through the fabric. I prefer to start its routing at the top of the shoulder as this area will be the simplest for the final connection of the 2 cable ends. It will be easier to temporarily place a small cap over the end of the cable so that you can pass through the mesh more easily, which is included in the kit. The cable should run through the fabric for about 1 inch and then around the outside of the fabric for about 1 inch and so forth. Just keep following the cable routing path that you marked on the patient. Once you've completed the cable loop, zip tie several inches of extra cable to the loop. Once it's back on the patient, you'll be able to adjust the length of the cable within the loop to fine-tune the fit, before permanently connecting the 2 ends. Next, connect 4 buckles to 1-inch straps. You will use 2 of these on the front and 2 on the back. The 2 front buckles will need to be easily self-adjustable by the patient, as well as easy and quick to don and doff one-handed. The posterior buckles will as well need to be donned and doffed and adjustable one-handed, but their connections should be more secure so that they don't accidentally become disconnected during donning and doffing of the socket. Try the vest back on the patient now and add the stabilizing unit frame over the top of the fabric section. I'll typically make my stabilizing unit test socket out of the Vivac or equivalent material. The final stabilizing unit frame will be about as flexible as the Vivac, so it should give a close approximation of the final stiffness. I've attached the included low-profile Velcro over the anterior and distal lateral areas of the stabilizing unit frame. You really only need a few small sections of Velcro and don't necessarily need to cover the entire frame section as I have in the picture. Stretch and tuck the fabric up around the frame and stick it to the Velcro. The tighter you pull the distal lateral end of the fabric, the more it will post the shoulder joint proximally. You'll be able to adjust this more once the prosthetic arm's weight is attached as well. The fabric that spans within the stabilizing unit frame should be stretched like a drum, tight enough to distribute the forces broadly across the torso. Go ahead and attach the force straps to the front and back of the stabilizing unit frame and to the force distribution cable. On the front and back of the stabilizing unit frame, attach the strap connection points as far proximally and distally as possible, as shown in the picture. You'll attach the other end of the straps around the force distribution cable. The location of the connection on the cable will determine the line of forces that spread through the fabric. You'll adjust these locations on the patient to spread the forces as comfortably as possible, mostly just to keep the line of pull away from the axilla. You can see here how the fabric is now stretched tight enough and the extras tucked in. Now when the anterior and posterior straps are pulled tight, the fabric socket should fit nicely to the patient. Continue to adjust the fit simply by unvelcroing the fabric, stretching it tighter or looser, and revelcroing it back down. Spin a piece of fabric over the top of the shoulder between the anterior and posterior stabilizing unit frame ends. This will help stabilize the frame and prevent it from yawning out under loads. This fabric may actually contact the user, but once the fabric socket is fully fit to the user, there will not be much vertical downward force pushing into this area. Keep the fabric as wide as you're able to and connect it to the frame using the low profile Velcro on the back side and wrap the fabric 180 degrees around to hold it securely. Now trim off any extra fabric. You typically won't need any extra padding in the axilla area, as the fabric should not be pulled too tight here. However, if the patient has excess tissue that causes the fabric to rope in a bit, it may be helpful to sew some padding to the edge of the axilla area so that the material doesn't rope into the soft tissue. Here we're simply using a scrap piece of nylon back neoprene. We can now fold it over and staple it in place, and then sew it to the fabric. Fine-tune the fitting by adjusting the length of the force distribution cable. The extra cable should slide past the zip ties and allow you to slightly adjust the overall length. Mark the desired total length, as you will trim the cable to length in the following step and bond the two ends together. Once you have removed the fabric socket from the patient, you can cut the cable to length. Cut one end of the metal pin with some Fabtech adhesive and insert it into one end of the cable. Next, repeat the process and secure the other half of the metal pin into the other end of the force distribution cable using Fabtech adhesive. This will close the loop of the cable. Be sure to measure the exact length of the remaining cable, as you will use that as part of your pattern to save for your patient. You also want to mark on the fabric the final cable routing path so that you can replicate it again on additional fabric sections. The patient will likely get multiple fabric sections so that they can swap them out for washing. The socket fitting is now complete. Integrate the electrodes within the fabric. I like to use magnet snap electrodes as they're easy to connect into the fabric and are user-friendly for the patient to disconnect the wires when they are removed and replace the fabric for washing. You're now ready to attach any other arm components. As your patient is testing out their new socket, you can continue to make minor fitting adjustments. Here, for example, we move the connection points of the anterior straps to be closer together across the center of the chest. This moved the line of pull to span more across the middle of the side of the fabric section and move the forces away from the distal trim lines in the axilla areas. At this point, you're effectively done with the socket fabrication. Now just focus on finding the right electrode placement and arm component integration. You should be ready now to transfer to the definitive materials. You should have already captured the final pattern of the fabric section so that you can replicate at least a second or third set for the patient. This will allow the patient to replace the fabric section for washing. At this point, you still have plenty of ability to make socket adjustments by stretching the fabric tighter or looser within the stabilizing unit. The compliant nature and self-adjustability element of the socket design will be sufficient to allow for accommodation of a considerable amount of weight gain or loss. As you work through any of your fittings, don't hesitate to use me as a resource. I'm happy to answer any questions that may come along the way. If you would prefer to have me come join you in person to help out with any fitting, I am available for an in-person fitting with you and your patient. Or if you would like to pursue media attention on any of your fittings, just let me know. Happy to be a resource however I can be, and can provide pictures, videos, or narrative as needed. This is a great technology to leverage for media exposure. And finally, I hope that this training stirs new ideas and improvements on your end as well. Be sure to share with me and the community about your experience. This is a phenomenal socket design, but we are always working to push the limits of improving it even more. As I continue to learn, I will continue to share the added knowledge with you, and I hope that you will do the same. Thank you so much.